Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing well. I'm Sydney, as the slide above indicates. I'm excited to talk with you guys kind of about two things today. One, my personal experience interning at Pydantic. I'm now a full-time software developer there. And then also kind of my learnings about open source in general during that year. Going to talk a little bit about my personal background, how I got to Pydantic, that sort of thing. Then I'll go into a little bit of a Pydantic overview. This is by no means a technical presentation, but just so you have some context if you're not familiar with Pydantic, the company or the open source tool. The meat of this presentation is going to be talking about what I call the open source machine. So sort of my learnings there, that sort of thing. I would specifically like to touch on the early career value that I think contributing to open source brings. Obviously, there are challenges associated with open source, so we'll make sure to touch on those, and then we'll do kind of a quick summary and then Q&A. So the very quick summary, or what you should probably take away from this presentation, is that I think everyone, whether you're a college student or young developer or senior developer, should be engaging with open source. I think communication is absolutely key in the world of open source, but then in development in general. And then I also think, and open source is a great avenue for this, that immersing yourself in exemplary code, and I'll amend here also exemplary documentation, is really critical both for your productivity on a team and then also kind of improving your own technical skill set. Without further ado, kind of jump into my personal background here. I currently work as a software developer at Pydantic. I'm 21 years old, so I graduated the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the US in May, and then right after graduating, took a flight to PyCon US to give my first talk there. I was at UW for 3 years studying. I started in engineering and computer science, and then decided I liked computer science enough to just pursue that. I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I know most people here are not from the States, but it's where the University of North Carolina is, if anyone's familiar. In my free time, I love to spend time outdoors. Very excited to be getting to see more of Braga and Portugal this trip. It's very nice weather compared to Boston, where I live right now. Alrighty, so a little bit more of my timeline. How did I get here? I started doing software development at the age of 15, I would say, seriously. So I started working at a local startup company in Chapel Hill, kind of discovered I loved coding, and then got kind of my first real software development internship at an insurance tech company. In November of 2021 was when I was first exposed to Pydantic. I was building an API client library, and we started to use Pydantic to model our requests and responses. As I mentioned, I'll touch a little bit more on what is Pydantic, the open source library, shortly, but basically helps you validate and structure data. So I was very attracted to Pydantic. I started kind of using it all over the place in my code base. And then a bit later in 2023, was working at a different company, and we were doing kind of finance tech work, also very API related. And so I integrated Pydantic models with Django REST framework stuff. And this was when I kind of did my first open source contribution to a library called DRF Spectacular, which helps to kind of integrate documentation for Django REST framework and define models for requests and responses. So up until this point, the theme had very much been I love APIs, I love more structured data in Python, that sort of thing. And then I saw a post from Samuel, the author of Pydantic, that they were starting a company. And so I reached out to him, and in September of 2023, so last year, I started my kind of open source focused internship there. I was finishing up my senior year of college, and so just worked part-time with them for about a year. And then takes us to June of 2024 when I graduated and then kind of rolled over into full-time work. I think the main takeaway from this timeline for me is just that if you are a student or advising a student or in any of those sorts of roles, I think it's really beneficial to work or try to find software development work while you are studying computer science. I think you learn lots of really important things about like process and collaboration and things like that you won't necessarily learn from the like raw technical details that you're learning at university or even at like a boot camp or something like that. So it was great to be able to kind of work with software development teams during that like educational part of my experience. And then, yeah, very excited to get to roll over into full-time work now. So let's do a little bit of a Pydantic overview just to give some helpful context. Pydantic started as an open source tool founded in, I believe, 2017, might have been 2018, by Samuel, who's the same guy who has now started a company around Pydantic. It's best known for its like data validation properties, so you can define a model and use like native Python type hints to apply like constraints, and then Pydantic validates that data holds that certain model's shape. So you could have like a user model that has a name that's a string, and then maybe an ID number that's an integer, and then a birthday that's a date time. And when you pass user data in, either from JSON or Python, Pydantic validates that data. So it's basically like runtime enforcement of types, which is really helpful. You can imagine in cases like machine learning pipelines when you're like, oh my gosh, I have so much data, like I really need to make sure it's in the right shape for me to be able to do analysis, or API requests and responses. I feel like a broken record now, but it's really helpful for documentation. And that takes me into my next point. I'll kind of jump over to the JSON schema here, which is that the models provide a helpful structure for documentation. So if you've got like an API where you're requesting user data, you can use those models with like aliases and additional like JSON schema descriptions and things like that to really build out your documentation in an integrated way. And then finally, going to this middle point, Pydantic is great with serialization, which helps with kind of the round trip ability in an API context. Like you have JSON data, validate it, do some modifications, and then send it back out in JSON. So really just bringing like structure and type enforcement to Python. Obviously a dynamically typed language, so it doesn't have that natively, but it kind of helps to bridge the gap between like a statically typed language is sometimes too strict and hard to work with and has, you know, tons of boilerplate and that sort of thing. Python, maybe not strict enough sometimes, and helps to bridge that gap. So that's kind of the tool that I jumped into working on. What did I do in my year of open source? I will probably spend the most time on this slide just because there's a lot to cover, but the categories of kind of my open source work in general, and I would say also the work of a lot of other open source developers, falls into these kind of 4 categories. So repository like administration. This is like the maybe most communication heavy of all of the things that I did. So this is like every day. I log into GitHub and I look at the new open issues. I answer questions on our discussion panel. I review lots of PRs, which excitingly is increasingly becoming a larger part of my job, which means we're getting more and more contributions from individual contributors, which is wonderful to see. And then communicating with contributors. So like iterating with people on PRs, or chatting with folks about like what are the highest priority features, or if you're a new contributor, like what can you help us work on? And this is one of my favorite parts of the job. It's a little bit easy to get swept away in the volume of issues and pull requests and things that we have, but it's this lovely combination of like, I get to talk about this cool system that we've built, I get to help other people learn about it, I learn from other people regarding their like skill sets and opinions, and then also it just makes it feel like a much more collaborative job. Going into the next category here, this is the most like development, like I'm just gonna code section. So like after I've gone through issues and things to prioritize what we're working on, just purely doing the work of like bug fixes, feature requests, implementing change requests. And I should have a little subtext here. With the change requests, I think that's the most like nuanced and challenging changes that I make. Just because we try to be really careful about like backwards compatibility and things like that. If any of you use Pydantic, you know that we kind of did a V1 to V2 jump that was not fully backwards compatible. And so I think given the response from the community, we've tried to make sure that any changes in the future are a little bit more gentle for our users. So kind of learning to navigate that world of like, how do we make things better, but also like make things continue to work for folks that are expecting them to. Documentation, very, very important. I would say my previous experiences, and probably the experiences that many of you all have had at companies, lack like thorough documentation. I just wrote a blog post about this because I saw someone made an argument, basically the case against documentation, and the idea was that documentation takes too much time. Like, you should just be able to jump into well-written code and understand what's going on and like make progress that way. My two counter arguments were sort of like, consider the users who like really benefit from documentation, and you can really draw people into using a tool with thorough documentation. So we try to do that with these kind of categories of docs. So that's like conceptual, like why do you want to use Pydantic? API docs, so like, okay, great, I'm using Pydantic, like how do I do it? What parameter do I use for this? Or show me an example, or that sort of thing. Leads me into examples. We try to add like examples and integration docs that elaborate on that like why point. So it's like, okay, conceptually I get it, let me see an example of like why this is truly relevant for this context. Clarifying edits, that's like a small thing. And side note, if you're looking to contribute to open source, like a great first way to get started is like, if you're confused by something in the docs, someone else is too, and like, let's, fix that and make it more clear. And then lastly, blog posts. So my first rebuttal was the like, think about the users point to the anti-documentation blog post. And then my second rebuttal was like, writing documentation helps you write better code. Because if you have to explain it and you're trying to explain something and it's really not going well, you're gonna then think to yourself, okay, I need to write this documentation. Why don't I like design my code better first so that the documentation part is easy. Alrighty, and then the fourth category of things is sort of release management. This is the most organizational category of things. So this is like cycle planning, whether or not you use like agile systems or, just 2-week sprints or whatever that may be. We try to do a decent amount of planning and then also publicizing those plans. It is an open source project, so we're like trying to be transparent with the community, which is honestly a joy because when people see that their feature or bug fix or whatever it may be is getting put into your sprint, it makes them, excited. It's like a nice, positive way to interact with the community. Project scoping kind of fits within that umbrella of things. Definitely something that I have, as I'm sure many of you have learned, is that like I do a good job of underestimating tasks sometimes when I really shouldn't. So trying to kind of control those expectations and moderate that sort of thing. Distributing workload across our very small team, and then release logistics. I had never done this before, but like, how do you release a package? How do you, make sure your release notes are clear? And if you do have to make any changes, God forbid, then, that's clear to folks and how they can sidestep that sort of thing. So once again, this is sort of the like very meaty, like what was I up to in the last year? And now I'm going to talk kind of about what I've learned from that and like, what can you learn? How can you get involved? Like, if you want to get involved in a limited way, like what are some of the parts of this that are the easiest to get started with, the most fun, the most challenging, that sort of thing. Okay, so the open source machine, I kind of just showed you all the like cogs behind the scenes of like what the heck is going on behind all these packages and management and that sort of thing. But what makes open source run? And my general summary, I would say, if you only decide to take one thing away from this talk, is that open source is truly all about community. Community specifically regarding communication with others. Open source projects couldn't function without the great support of individual contributors and community members. We're in sort of a unique position at Pydantic, the company, to have funding from a company supporting open source. Most open source projects don't have that. They're just, it's hard to get funding at all. So it's really like a recycling system where the community invests with contributions and questions and discussions, and then open source helps to give back to the community in this like helpful tool that helps to build all sorts of other amazing tools sort of way. And then I think because of this, the like crack the code answer to open source is like really focus on the community. Like how can you engage best with the community so that people are excited about the tool and people are excited to contribute and it's easy to contribute. And you kind of lower the learning curve for both like contributions and usage. I think when looking to improve a tool, specifically in the open source world, if you like back up all of your questions in like, how does this help the community or make it easier for the community, you get the best sort of open source tool. So, if we look at the data, I think it's pretty evident that Pydantic is important to the community. We just hit 270 million downloads a month, which is frankly a bit crazy. I need to remember that sometimes when I like go to make a release and, you know, might try to make a change and that sort of thing, which is like, this is impacting a lot of people. And that both makes it like a little bit stressful to do the work and then also pretty exciting because you're like, if I added this new feature or fixed this bug, like so many people are going to be excited about this and appreciative and that sort of thing. So it's both a like cautious game and a excitement adventure, I suppose. This is actually an understatement. I said 500 plus contributors. The GitHub analysis for the Pydantic repository shows about 600 right now. That doesn't include things like Pydantic core, which is our internal library, or Pydantic extra types, which is this like somewhat forgotten sibling on the side, just that sort of thing. So I think if you actually looked at our contributor numbers, it's probably closer to 1,000 across all of our open source projects, which is really exciting. Hopefully inching up after this talk as some of you look to contribute as well. And then in terms of usage, this is perhaps the most, I guess this goes with the downloads per month stat, but we have 512,000 repositories, according to GitHub once again, currently using Pydantic. And then that includes 16,000, maybe almost 20,000 packages that have pinned Pydantic as a dependency. So I think you can use this data to, once again, kind of motivate you into like, if I'm helping to work on an open source project, like my contributions are felt and they are appreciated and that's really rewarding. So I'm gonna chat a little bit about this more like meta-analysis now of open source, which is tying this back to community value, like what do I work on, what do I focus on, what brings value? So code and documentation quality, communication, and these like development feedback cycles, I think are kind of the pillars of open source. I'm gonna touch on each of these individually. So let's jump right in. Regarding clean code and documentation, I'll kind of start with the stat for each one. We have 325,000 docs visitors per month. This reminds me of the 270 million downloads stat, which is like, the pressure is high, but also the appreciation is there. So we want to make Pydantic, or any other open source tool that you can apply this to, super easy to use. Like, you should look at the front page of your documentation and think like, oh, that makes sense, I want to use that tool, within like, you know, under 30 seconds. I think Fast API, if you guys are familiar with that tool, does a wonderful job of making things look easy to use, and having like a high ratio of explanation to code can be really great. And then kind of the simplicity of your code is, I would say, one of the things that I've been working on is like, how can we communicate the point here in like as few lines of code as possible and like one very clear why statement. Improving the documentation and code sort of tempers the learning curve, both for users and for potential contributors. So it's great if your library is easy to use, but if you kind of jump into it and are like, great, I want to contribute, and you like don't know how to download things and get started, or like it's not clear how to create a pull request, or the code is really complex and like there's no guidelines as to good first issues or things like that, it makes it hard to engage with the community in a way that goes both ways. So yeah, I think the last point that I'll make about documentation, and I touch on this in the blog post as well, is that you lose complexity if you don't document patterns that are a little bit challenging or hard to understand. Because when future developers work on that code, they're not going to understand like why that logic needs to be preserved or why that logic is a certain way. And so if you do document things well and have clean code that kind of demonstrates confusing patterns, you can kind of maintain that like cleanliness and stability across contributors. So this is phrased a little bit in a confusing way, but basically the idea is like you can uphold standards and patterns and that sort of thing very well if you like have clear documentation and code. If things are a little bit haphazard or not explained well, because it is such a like community-focused thing with lots of individual contributors, then you don't like maintain that same standard. Chatting about communication. So we have about 50 active issues per week. That's not like 50 new issues, thank goodness, at the moment, but ones where there are discussions. And so this is just also referring to like issues on a GitHub repository, so like tickets where people are asking questions, reporting bugs, asking for features, that sort of thing. The keys with communication, specifically with the community, are like helping prioritize features. So like what is the most important thing that people really want? As I mentioned already, planning development cycles in a public way that kind of, one, holds us accountable to things, but then two, makes it so that users are pretty happy with the like turnover and expectations of the library. Organizing contributors, so like if someone comments on the repository like, hey, I'd love to help with this issue, like being prompt and kind of enabling them to help us. And then generally, I think communication with users is just a great way to understand the pain points, understand what's causing people the most challenge on a day-to-day basis, and like how we can alleviate that. So in the context of Pydantic, right now, I would say that's performance, specifically performance on build time. That's a V2 issue. V2 is much faster in lots of other ways, but that is something that users have voiced pretty like clearly with great examples. And so we as contributors are now like, okay, like this is an obvious problem. Let's like throw resources at it to kind of get back to the community in that way. And then the last pillar, this is going to tie into my next segment, which is about like the early career advantage that I think contributing to open source brings. But often open source tools are led and maintained by really experienced developers, and developers that have a lot to give in terms of domain knowledge and software development pattern knowledge and that sort of thing. And so if as a developer who's like looking to learn more, maybe you're a student, maybe you're just entered the workforce, if you contribute to open source projects, you can get awesome feedback from these really experienced developers at no cost, right? Like the barrier to entry is higher for feedback like this in almost all other circumstances. You have to first find an internship and then, find the right spot in the internship and get feedback from your boss who's maybe busy, that sort of thing. Open source, if you contribute, the maintainer is going to be very thankful and hopefully like get back to you quite promptly. And then you as a contributor can improve your like technical skills, domain knowledge, that sort of thing quite quickly. So kind of jumping into a little bit more about that early career advantage. You sort of can boost your software engineer skill set without, once again, that like higher barrier to entry. So if you're just getting started, I would say this is the most relevant for like university or bootcamp students or that sort of thing. You can get started with things like version control, like how do I use Git? What is Git? Opening pull requests, resolving merge conflicts. I was lucky enough to have that experience from some of my other internships, but I certainly was able to like enhance my skill set at Pydantic because, things are public. That encourages you to improve your quality of commit messages and things like that. I think the pressure of your work being public can be really beneficial from a like make my own work my best work standpoint. Read good code. This is maybe my favorite thing about open source from a technical perspective is that you're going to read code that is like better than code you've written, and hopefully you can kind of absorb those patterns. I feel like my first experience with this was seeing my coworker use Pydantic. I was like, oh my gosh, that looks so much better than what we've been doing already. Let me like adopt and absorb that. And you can kind of do the same, even getting started, contributing to Pydantic. I would read our internal code base and be like, wow, that is like much more documented than any other code that I've looked at. And so like, I need to hold up that standard sort of thing. And then another benefit from like a new software engineer perspective is you get to work with kind of this like release environment. So running pipelines and adding tests and doing automated formatting and like having commit standards and that sort of thing. These are all like little things that I just think aren't necessarily taught at university or boot camps quite as much unless you have a very like software engineering focused curriculum. So this is like a great environment to pick up those things. How does this practically take effect? I would say if you're at university, like go find one of the open source projects that you use, probably like Pandas or NumPy or things like that. Like look at issues and just like try to open one pull request and kind of get familiar with these sorts of things. I'm going to quickly touch on some open source challenges. These are pretty self-explanatory, but have definitely become evident in the last year. The biggest one, I'll tie this to like a personal anecdote, which is I was raised by my dad who worked always at small companies. And like ever since I was 5 years old, he was always hammering into my brother and I's brains, and he'd be like, you need to know who your customer is. And that's a good question for open source because there's not really a paying customer. Acquiring funding can be hard, and your like quote unquote customer is really your users who are not paying you. So I think you definitely have to, recognize that there's a delicate balance between like giving back to the community and then also like, needing time to do your own work that does pay. We're in a lucky position at Pydantic to have the kind of company-backed funding here. But yeah, I mean, the users are your customers, right? And so you just need to find that balance. As I mentioned, there's kind of sensitivity around breaking changes. Open source projects are not like greenfield projects. You have to preserve existing APIs and be careful about existing patterns and that sort of thing. So kind of learning to navigate that landscape has been interesting and challenging, but also good from a like software development and fragility perspective. And then there's a lot to do. Sometimes it's like an experience of decision fatigue for sure, like what to pick up next. There's, 400 issues and counting on Pydantic and 100 on Pydantic core and like what to do. But I think this is almost answered by the communication point, which is like if you're prioritizing things right and communicating enough with the users, then you can kind of figure out like what the most important next steps are. Takeaways. I sort of had my TLDR at the beginning of the presentation, but my biggest call to action is that it would be wonderful if you would contribute. This applies to like younger developers, older developers, like anyone. I think you're probably using open source tools. And so a great way to give back is to contribute yourself. It's pretty easy. You can start with like responding to issues and discussions, or even like asking questions yourself. I would say the easiest one on the like pull requests front is like help improve the documentation, but maybe you'll find yourself loving it as much as I did and like start adding features and fixing bugs. Yeah. Kind of tying this back to my own experience, hopefully you got to know a little bit more about like what the life of an open source developer looks like. I know I had not too many anecdotes, but hopefully enough, especially with that slide at the beginning with the like 4 categories of things to kind of better understand what's going on behind this like black box that is open source development. I would say my experience overall has been quite great. The like key behind my experience that made it so enjoyable is getting such wonderful advice from skilled developers. So Samuel and other people at the company who worked to build Pydantic in the first place have a lot of domain knowledge that they were kind of able to transfer, and I feel like my rate of learning working on open source was much higher than at any company I've worked at before, just because there is this like rapid development expectation and rapid feedback as well. Yeah, so thank you for listening. That was sort of about my experience with open source and learnings, and happy to answer any questions if folks have any.
Thank you, Sydney, for your talk. Now, if anyone has questions, I can come to you with the microphone. Right there.
Have you ever created an issue on your own to the repo, and then when you joined the community, have you resolved it by yourself also?
Yeah, good question. I don't think I created any issues on Pydantic before I joined the company, but I have created quite an abundance of issues since joining the company. So yeah, I think sometimes it's satisfying to create your own issues and like resolve them as a form of like, look, I'm, looking at this and finding ways to improve it and kind of being held accountable to those requests. At the same time, I think it's also nice to create issues that help like onboard new developers as well. Like yesterday, I added a couple of issues tagged with like good first issue, just to be like, okay, this can seem a little bit daunting to get started. Like, how can we help like onboard others?
And also, I wanted to ask, how it's possible to break something there? Have you ever broke something, or you were trying to fix a feature, but when you deployed it or something like that, you were noticing that it doesn't work like you wanted it to work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be great to give a talk at some point kind of about more of the nitty-gritty technical details about open source maintenance, because this was very like high level, like what are the names of things that I'm doing, but not like what does it look like day to day. But the short answer is yes, definitely have broken things. We try to work on a release cycle where we like do a minor release every 1 to 2 months, and then kind of the week following that minor release, we have a series of rapid patch releases to fix any issues. I would say most commonly we break things when we're changing something that isn't supposed to change behavior, and it like does. Like we're trying to, I guess more commonly we're like trying to fix something and we break something else that we haven't tested. Or we add a new feature and then someone submits an issue that's like, hey, this doesn't work yet in these ways, that sort of thing.
Thank you very much, and thank you for motivation to contribute. I think everyone likes it and will try. At least we'll think about it.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
Any more questions?
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I am very curious to know how does Pydantic, as having mainly an open source project, is able to survive financially. So how does Pydantic profit, or how does it work?
Yeah, great question. So we, Pydantic, the company, builds commercial tools that users can pay to use after exceeding this like free tier threshold. We currently are building an observability platform called Logfire. I would encourage you to visit our booth outside because we have some great like demos and posters and that sort of thing. But sort of the answer is we recognize that open source is like an incredible foundation for our like community rapport and things like that. And we're using the ideas that we use to build Pydantic and other open source tools to build similarly developer experience-oriented paid tools.
Thank you.
We have some time for one question. Anyone? Okay. Thank you very much, Sydney, for your talk.